Hi guys. Tonight we dive into a world where surviving the winter wasn't just about toughing it out, it was a way of life. Imagine living in a place where the sun barely rises for months, the cold seeps into your bones, and isolation is a constant companion. How did the Vikings not just survive, but thrive in these harsh conditions? Get comfortable because we're about to uncover the incredible survival strategies that helped shape Viking culture and why their resilience still echoes today. You don't want to miss this. The Viking people, who lived in the harsh, unforgiving climates of Scandinavia, faced some of the most extreme winter conditions in the world, with their settlements often situated in regions of the northernmost parts of Europe. The winters were long, cold, and dark. For the Vikings, survival during the winter months was a constant challenge that required resilience, resourcefulness, and careful planning. Their ability to endure the brutal northern winters, where temperatures could plummet far below freezing, snowstorms could last for days, and daylight was scarce, was central to their way of life. The winter season wasn't just a time of hardship, it was a defining aspect of their existence that shaped their daily routines, survival strategies, and even their social structures. Viking living conditions in the winter were grueling, yet their homes and lifestyles were adapted to these extreme circumstances. Many Vikings lived in longhouses, large communal dwellings that could house extended families and their livestock. These longhouses were built with thick wooden walls, a thatched roof, and often covered with turf or sod to insulate against the cold. In some cases, the Vikings constructed buildings using stone, which provided better thermal mass to retain heat. The roofs were steeply pitched to allow snow to slide off, preventing accumulation that could collapse the structure. Inside the longhouses, there was a central hearth, which provided both light and heat. This was crucial in winter, as the hearth was not just a place for cooking, but a vital heat source that could ward off the cold, at least within the immediate vicinity. However, despite these structural adaptations, the cold in Viking homes during the winter was something that had to be managed with care and attention to survival. The challenge of the brutal northern winters in Viking lands was far more than just a discomfort, it was a life-threatening circumstance. Temperatures in the northern regions could drop drastically during the winter months, reaching lows of minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. With such extreme cold, survival during winter depended on how well one could insulate and heat their home, and how well they could conserve food, clothing, and firewood. Long nights meant fewer opportunities to hunt or forage, while short days and limited sunlight also made it difficult to maintain physical work, leaving the Vikings largely indoors, confined to their homes or the warmth of their fires. Snowstorms were common, and they could cut off villages from essential supplies, creating isolation that compounded the difficulty of daily life. The Vikings were no strangers to this type of challenge, and their daily lives were intricately linked to the rhythms of the seasons. Their ability to endure the brutal winters, however, was not just a matter of physical endurance. It was also deeply connected to how they managed their time, their resources, and their rest. The importance of sleep during the winter months cannot be understated, as it was not merely a time for rest, but an essential part of survival. During the long nights of winter, when the sun set early and didn't rise again until late in the morning, sleep was crucial for maintaining the health and energy of the body. For the Vikings, sleep was integral to their routines and how they survived the challenging conditions that the cold months presented. In Viking culture, the rhythm of life revolved around the cycles of nature, the seasons, and the need to conserve energy during the colder months. During the winter, the Vikings typically slept longer hours than in the warmer seasons, as the cold and dark left little to do outside. The long nights meant that people spent more time inside their homes, gathering together around the fire for warmth, storytelling, and rest. The nature of Viking homes also facilitated this sleep pattern. Long houses, though often shared with animals to conserve heat, created a communal environment in which warmth, comfort, and safety were prioritized. Everyone would sleep close to the hearth, and those at the farthest reaches of the house were generally the most vulnerable to the cold. The Viking families, bound by their need for survival, would take turns tending the fire, ensuring that the flames remained alive throughout the night to provide warmth. Sleep in such conditions was not merely for relaxation, but a vital part of the survival process. It helped conserve energy, which was especially important when food supplies were low and physical exertion had to be carefully managed. Moreover, in these long periods of sleep, the Vikings' bodies could recover from the toll that the winter months took on them. The importance of sleep extended beyond individual needs. It was also essential for the community as a whole. A well rested community was a more resilient one, able to work together when needed, whether it was for repairs, communal chores, or preparing for the arrival of spring. The Viking lifestyle also made sure to account for the challenges of the cold in a more holistic sense. Their clothing, made from animal skins, wool, and furs, was designed for insulation, helping them retain warmth during the coldest months. The Vikings were skilled in making warm and durable garments, from layered tunics to fur lined hoods, ensuring that even when they had to venture outside during the winter months, they could do so without the risk of frostbite or exposure. Clothing was a form of protection, not just from the cold, but also from the physical strain of living in such a harsh environment. Food storage was another area where the Vikings adapted to the cold. Without refrigeration, they relied on other methods of preserving food, such as drying, salting, and smoking, to ensure they had enough sustenance to survive the long months of winter. Their diet, which consisted mainly of preserved meats, grains, and root vegetables, was often supplemented by hunting or fishing during the winter when the waters weren't frozen. However, even during these times, the Vikings knew that conserving energy was crucial, and thus they were careful not to waste any resources. They also engaged in communal feasting as a way to bond together and share the limited food stores they had for the season. While sleep was vital to survival, it was also central to the Viking understanding of the world. Norse mythology, which shaped their worldview, often connected sleep with dreams, the realms of gods, and spiritual significance. In many ways, sleep was seen as a way to connect with the divine or seek guidance for what was to come. The long, dark nights of winter were a time for reflection, dreams, and preparing for the future. Winter was a time of rest, but also of waiting, waiting for the thaw, for the return of light, and for the renewal that would come with spring. For the Vikings, survival through the brutal northern winters was not merely about enduring the cold, but about adapting every part of their lives to it, from their homes and clothing to their communal life and understanding of sleep. Each aspect of Viking existence during the winter months was interconnected. Sleep, perhaps more than anything else, was a vital component of their survival, as it allowed them to rest, conserve energy, and endure the darkest, most challenging part of the year. By managing their sleep, their food, and their community life, the Vikings ensured that they were able to face the brutal winters with the strength and resilience that defined their people. Despite the extreme conditions, the Viking way of life during the winter months was a testament to their adaptability and their deep connection to the cycles of nature that governed their world. Viking homes, the centers of daily life in medieval Scandinavia, were not just shelters from the harsh elements, but also a reflection of the resourceful and practical mindset of the Viking people. These homes, primarily longhouses, were designed with functionality in mind, allowing the Vikings to thrive in one of the coldest and most unforgiving environments on Earth. In order to survive the brutal northern winters, Viking homes had to be constructed with particular materials and techniques that provided warmth and insulation. The longhouse, which served as the typical dwelling, was a testament to Viking ingenuity and their deep connection to the land, animals, and the natural resources available to them. The construction of Viking homes was an intricate process that combined traditional knowledge with practical experience. Longhouses were the cornerstone of Viking domestic architecture and in many ways were designed to meet the challenging demands of the climate. A typical Viking longhouse was a large rectangular building that could house an extended family, their livestock, and sometimes even additional workers or visitors. These longhouses varied in size, but many were substantial, often 15 to 30 meters in length and 5 to 8 meters in width. The structure of the longhouse was typically built using wooden beams for the framework, with walls made from a combination of wood, turf, and sometimes even stone, depending on the availability of materials. The construction of these houses followed principles that ensured the most efficient use of available resources. The frame of the longhouse was often made from sturdy timber, typically oak, which was abundant in Viking Scandinavia. The walls were constructed by placing vertical posts into the ground and securing them with horizontal beams. These beams formed the skeleton of the structure. The roof, which was one of the most important aspects of the longhouse in terms of insulation and weatherproofing, was steeply pitched to allow snow to slide off and prevent heavy accumulation that could collapse the building. The thatched roofs were usually made from a mixture of grasses and reeds, while other Viking buildings, such as stave churches, used more durable materials like timber for both structural and aesthetic purposes. The steep roofline was not just a functional element, but also a part of the aesthetic identity of Viking architecture, symbolizing the connection to the land and the natural elements. The walls of the Viking longhouse were a carefully crafted mixture of materials designed to provide warmth and protection. In many cases, the walls were constructed from a combination of wattle and daub, a technique that involved weaving thin wooden branches, wattle together, and then covering them with a thick layer of clay, mud, or a mixture of both. Daub. This technique created a solid barrier against the cold and also helped to regulate the temperature inside the house. In addition to wattle and daub, turf was commonly used in the construction of Viking homes, particularly for the upper portions of the walls. Turf, which was cut from the ground in thick sod layers, provided excellent insulation against the cold and was readily available in the Nordic regions. It was also relatively easy to work with, making it a practical choice for the Viking builders. The use of turf helped to keep the homes insulated and provided a level of protection from the wind, which could otherwise penetrate the walls and make the interior of the house unbearably cold. In addition to the main structural materials, Viking homes were often adorned with animal skins, furs, and other organic materials to further insulate the interior. These materials were not just decorative. They played a crucial role in ensuring that the inhabitants of the home stayed warm and comfortable during the long winter months. Animal skins, particularly those of reindeer, bear, and wolves, were used to cover furniture, line the walls, and even provide bedding for the family. These furs were highly effective insulators as they trapped body heat and provided an extra layer of protection against the cold air. In some cases, the Vikings would even use animal pelts to create curtains or partitions within the home, creating small insulated spaces where individuals could sleep or work. The hearth was the focal point of Viking homes, especially during the winter months. It was the source of heat, light, and cooking, and it played an essential role in maintaining the warmth of the home. Typically located at the center of the longhouse, the hearth was a raised fire pit, often surrounded by a stone or clay border to contain the fire. The hearth would burn wood, and the heat from the fire would radiate outward, warming the room and creating a central gathering place for the family. In addition to providing warmth, the hearth also helped to dry clothes and keep the house free of dampness, which was a major concern in the cold, wet climate of Scandinavia. The smoke from the fire would exit the house through a smoke hole or chimney in the roof, but the design of the Viking longhouse was such that the smoke would also help to seal the joints in the walls, further insulating the structure and ensuring that the heat from the fire stayed inside. The interior of Viking homes was typically simple and practical, reflecting the harsh realities of living in such a cold, unforgiving climate. The furnishings were often basic, consisting of wooden benches, tables, and storage chests, all designed with functionality in mind. The Vikings did not have the luxury of excess or ornate decoration, but the furniture they did have was sturdy and designed to withstand the cold and damp conditions. Wooden beams supported the roof and walls, while the floors were often covered with straw, hay, or animal skins to provide some insulation from the cold earth beneath. In larger longhouses, the central area would be left open to accommodate communal activities such as cooking, eating, and socializing around the hearth. Viking stave churches. Another key aspect of Viking architecture had a slightly different design compared to the longhouse, but they still shared many of the same materials and construction methods. Stave churches were built with vertical wooden posts, known as staves, which supported the structure. These churches were often elaborately decorated with carvings and intricate designs, and they were considered sacred spaces. Like the longhouses, stave churches were built with a combination of wood, turf, and sometimes stone, and their roofs were designed to shed snow and provide insulation against the cold. The interiors of stave churches were often adorned with wooden benches and altars, and the entire structure was built to keep out the cold while allowing the congregation to gather in relative warmth and safety. Insulation was a major concern for the Vikings, especially given the extreme cold of their environment. The methods they used to insulate their homes were practical and based on the materials available to them. As mentioned, the use of turf and wattle and daub techniques was essential in providing insulation. The thick walls created by these materials helped to trap warmth inside and keep the cold air out. The Vikings also took advantage of the natural environment around them, utilizing the dense forests for wood, the abundant grasses for thatching, and the rich soil for turf. Additionally, the Vikings used natural windbreaks, such as trees and hills, to protect their homes from the full force of the wind, which could cause a significant drop in temperature. Another important aspect of Viking insulation was their ability to store firewood for the winter months. The Vikings understood that maintaining a consistent fire was crucial to surviving the cold, and they made sure to stockpile wood during the warmer months. They would store firewood in well protected areas, such as dry, sheltered spaces near the longhouse, so it was easily accessible during the long winter months when the snow and ice would make it difficult to gather new wood. The wood was carefully dried and stacked to ensure it burned efficiently and produced the necessary heat to keep the longhouse warm. The combination of these elements, wood, turf, animal skins, and careful construction techniques, allowed the Vikings to build homes that were surprisingly well insulated against the cold, despite the harsh winters. The materials they used and the methods they employed were a testament to their deep understanding of the environment and their ability to adapt to it. While Viking homes were simple, they were well designed to keep out the cold, provide warmth, and allow families to survive and thrive in one of the most challenging climates in the world. The longhouses, with their central hearths, insulated walls, and practical furnishings, were more than just shelters. They were an essential part of Viking survival, offering protection from the brutal northern winters and creating a warm communal space where the Viking way of life could continue to flourish. In the harsh, cold winters of Viking lands, the hearth was far more than just a source of heat. It was the heart of Viking homes. The Viking longhouse, which served as the main dwelling for families, was designed around a central hearth where fire was the vital lifeblood of daily life. These hearths were crucial in providing warmth, cooking food, and offering light during the long, dark nights of winter. Without fire, survival in the bitter cold would have been nearly impossible. The open hearth played an indispensable role in maintaining both physical and social warmth, creating a shared space where families could gather, bond, and find respite from the cold winds that howled outside. The open hearth in Viking homes was typically a simple but effective structure positioned in the center of the longhouse. It was often raised slightly above the floor and surrounded by a low stone or clay barrier. This raised design was essential in controlling the fire and preventing it from spreading throughout the home. The hearth was open, with no chimney, so the smoke would rise up toward the roof, exiting through a smoke hole or vent. This design, though primitive, was effective in the Viking context and reflected their deep understanding of how to make the best use of the materials at their disposal. The smoke would not only carry away the harmful gases produced by the fire, but also help to cure the wood and seal the house, adding another layer of insulation against the cold. The hearth was central to daily life, both as a source of survival and as a communal focal point. The role of fire extended far beyond just heating the home. In the Viking world, fire was used for cooking, drying clothes, and preserving food. The hearth allowed Vikings to prepare their meals in a way that would have been impossible without fire. For much of the year, the cold and snow made it difficult, if not impossible, to grow crops or gather fresh food. The Vikings relied heavily on preserved foods, such as salted meats, dried fish, and root vegetables, which could be cooked on the hearth for warmth and sustenance. Cooking over an open flame also provided them with the ability to bake bread, boil stews, and prepare complex meals in a relatively short period of time. Viking cooking pots were typically placed directly over the flame, suspended on hooks or chains that could be adjusted depending on the level of heat needed. The ability to cook food over the hearth was essential for nutrition, providing not only warmth but also a necessary source of sustenance to survive the long winter months. In addition to cooking, fire also played a critical role in drying clothes and preserving food. The Viking winter was notoriously damp, and the cold moisture could make it difficult to keep clothing and bedding dry. Vikings would use the warmth of the hearth to dry their clothes, which would often become wet from exposure to snow, ice, or the persistent drizzle of rain. These clothes were typically made from animal skins, wool, and other natural materials that could become heavy with moisture and cold. Placing wet clothing near the fire helped them dry out quickly, making them more comfortable to wear in the bitter cold. The heat from the fire also allowed the Vikings to dry and preserve food. Fish and meats were often smoked above the flames, allowing them to store food for the winter and beyond. This preservation method was essential for survival, as fresh food was in short supply during the harsh winter months, and the ability to store it properly could mean the difference between life and death. Managing fire safety in the Viking home was crucial, particularly during the long dark winter nights when the hearth was continuously burning. Without modern chimneys or other fire suppression systems, fire safety was a significant concern for the Vikings. The open hearth posed a constant risk of spreading flames to the rest of the structure. To mitigate these risks, Viking homes were designed to help contain the fire and limit its potential to cause harm. For instance, the low stone or clay barrier surrounding the hearth acted as a protective barrier, preventing the fire from reaching the wooden walls or floor. Additionally, the fact that the hearth was centrally located in the longhouse meant that it was more easily monitored, with family members able to keep an eye on it throughout the night. The smoke hole in the roof was another critical component in managing fire safety. This hole, or vent, allowed smoke and gases to escape the home, preventing the accumulation of harmful fumes such as carbon monoxide. It was also an essential part of the design, as it helped regulate the temperature within the home by allowing excess heat to escape. While smoke was an inevitable byproduct of the open hearth, the roof and smoke hole were crucial in ensuring that the air inside the longhouse remained breathable and that fire did not pose a danger to the inhabitants. Smoke could sometimes settle within the room, which led to the dark, smoky interiors that were characteristic of Viking homes, but it was still far better than the suffocating atmosphere that could result from the fire being confined without a means of ventilation. Despite these precautions, fire accidents were still a real concern. The Vikings understood that fire was both a tool for survival and a potential hazard. The wood used for the construction of the longhouse was often treated with fire-resilient techniques, such as soaking it in water or using pitch to seal it, reducing the risk of the wood igniting from stray embers or sparks. Even with these precautions, however, the Vikings had to remain vigilant. In some instances, Viking longhouses were built in clusters, with multiple homes located close together. This arrangement meant that a fire in one home could quickly spread to others, which led to the practice of constructing fire breaks, open spaces, or gaps between houses, designed to limit the spread of flames. The Vikings also practiced fire drills, with members of the community ensuring they had an escape plan should a fire break out in the dead of night. The importance of fire in Viking society extended beyond the domestic realm and played a significant role in their social and cultural practices. Fire was not only necessary for survival, it was also central to the spiritual beliefs of the Vikings. In Norse mythology, fire was often seen as a gift from the gods, a powerful force that was both life giving and destructive. Fire was associated with several deities, including Loki, the trickster god of fire, and Freya, the goddess of love and fertility, who was believed to have the power to control fire. The hearth, as the primary source of fire in the home, was often regarded as a sacred space where families would gather not only to survive, but also to connect with their ancestors, share stories, and offer sacrifices to the gods. As the Viking people ventured further from their homelands and established settlements across Europe, fire continued to play an essential role in their lives. Viking longhouses, wherever they were built, maintained a similar reliance on the open hearth for warmth, cooking, and fire safety. Viking ships, too, were equipped with fires to keep sailors warm during long voyages. A portable fire source was often carried on board for this purpose, along with cooking implements for preparing meals during the journey. Viking settlers in far flung regions of Britain and Ireland would adapt the same principles they used at home to ensure that their fire systems provided warmth and cooking capabilities in their new environments. As the long dark winters dragged on, the Vikings learned to master fire as both a practical and symbolic force. Their ability to manage and control fire was integral to their survival, and it was this mastery that allowed them to thrive in one of the harshest climates in the world. The hearth at the center of Viking homes was not just a source of heat, but also a space for social interaction, a symbol of family unity, and a powerful connection to the divine forces they believed in. Despite the dangers inherent in fire, it was an indispensable part of Viking life, one that helped them survive the long, brutal winters and create the strong, tight knit communities that defined their civilization. Through ingenuity, vigilance, and respect for the elements, the Vikings made fire their ally, allowing them to endure the cold and dark and continue their way of life for generations. During the long and brutal winters of Scandinavia, the Vikings had to adapt in every way possible to ensure their survival. The harsh conditions, characterized by freezing temperatures, snowstorms, and limited daylight, required the Vikings to be resourceful and inventive, particularly when it came to clothing and bedding. The materials they used, the way they layered their clothing, and the methods they employed to create warmth during sleep were all essential for enduring the cold months. Viking clothing and bedding were not just practical solutions for survival, they were also a reflection of the Vikings' intimate connection to the land, the animals they hunted, and the natural resources around them. The Viking clothing system was built on a foundation of materials that were both available in their environment and well suited to the cold and often wet conditions of winter. Wool, fur, and leather were the primary materials used to make the clothes that would shield them from the freezing temperatures. Wool, in particular, was highly prized for its insulating properties. The Vikings raised sheep for both their wool and meat, and wool was a staple material used for making a wide range of garments, from tunics and cloaks to socks and gloves. Wool is a natural insulator, trapping air between its fibers and keeping the wearer warm even when it gets wet. This was particularly important in the often damp conditions of Viking lands, where rain and snow could quickly soak through other fabrics. Fur was another essential material in Viking winter clothing. The Vikings were skilled hunters, and they made full use of the animals they hunted, not only for food but also for their pelts. Fur-lined cloaks, hats, and boots were common items in a Viking's wardrobe, providing both warmth and protection from the elements. Fur traps heat against the body and acts as a barrier against the cold, making it an ideal material for outerwear. The Vikings would use the pelts of animals such as bears, reindeer, wolves, and foxes to craft garments that would keep them warm in the harshest weather. The insulating properties of fur, combined with its waterproof qualities, made it indispensable for surviving Viking winters. Leather was also a significant material for Viking clothing, especially for footwear, belts, and gloves. Leather shoes were designed to provide both warmth and protection for the feet, which were often exposed to wet and cold conditions. The Vikings also used leather for other clothing items, such as tunic trims, gloves, and hoods, adding durability and flexibility to their wardrobe. Leather was particularly important for its ability to resist wind and water, keeping the body shielded from the worst of the elements while also being breathable, which helped prevent overheating when moving or working. The Viking approach to clothing was not just about having individual garments, it was about layering those garments to maximize warmth and comfort. Layering was a fundamental strategy for retaining heat, especially when it came to sleep. The Vikings knew that staying warm at night was just as important as staying warm during the day, and their clothing system reflected this understanding. Layering allowed the Vikings to regulate their body temperature by adding or removing layers, depending on their activity level or the severity of the cold. The innermost layer was typically made from wool or linen, materials that were soft against the skin and provided an insulating foundation. These base layers would absorb sweat and moisture, helping to keep the body dry even when engaging in physical activities or exposed to moisture. Above the base layer, Vikings would wear thicker woolen garments, such as tunics, skirts, or leggings, which provided additional insulation. These garments were often woven tightly to prevent cold air from getting through, trapping body heat and maintaining warmth. Over this, a Viking might wear a cloak or a larger woolen coat, further increasing their insulation. The cloak was a common outer garment, and it was typically fastened with a brooch at the shoulder, allowing it to hang loosely over the wearer's body. Cloaks made of thick wool or lined with fur helped block wind and rain, and the weight of the fabric provided an additional layer of warmth. When it came to sleep, the process of layering was just as important as it was during the day. The Vikings understood that to survive the long cold nights, it was essential to trap as much warmth as possible while minimizing heat loss. They would wear several layers of clothing to bed, including woolen tunics, leggings, and sometimes fur-lined garments. The layers would provide warmth and protection, ensuring that even if the fire in the hearth started to die down during the night, the Vikings would still be insulated enough to avoid hypothermia. The use of wool and fur in their sleepwear also helped keep the Vikings dry, as these materials could wick away moisture and prevent the body from getting too cold due to sweat or dampness. However, clothing alone was not enough to ensure a comfortable and warm sleep. Bedding was just as important, and the Vikings used a variety of materials to create warm, insulated sleeping arrangements. The typical Viking bed consisted of a straw mattress, which was placed directly on the ground or on a simple wooden frame. Straw was an abundant and inexpensive material that provided a layer of cushioning between the sleeper and the cold, hard earth. Though not as soft as modern mattresses, straw mattresses were effective in insulating against the cold and providing a relatively comfortable sleeping surface. To further increase warmth, Vikings would use animal skins and furs to cover their straw mattresses. These furs, often from animals such as reindeer, sheep, and wolves, were excellent insulators. The thick, dense fur trapped air close to the body, helping to retain heat during the night. Animal skins were also used as blankets, providing a protective layer that kept out the cold and kept the sleeper warm. These furs were particularly useful in the deep winter months when temperatures could plummet to dangerous lows. They also added an extra layer of comfort, as the fur was soft and warm to the touch, making for a more pleasant sleeping experience. In addition to animal skins, wool blankets were commonly used to provide an additional layer of warmth during the winter. Wool, with its natural insulating properties, was ideal for blankets, as it would trap heat and wick away moisture, ensuring that the Vikings stayed dry and warm throughout the night. Woolen blankets were often woven by hand, and they could be quite thick, adding a significant amount of warmth to the bedding. These blankets were especially important for families living in longhouses, where the warmth from the central hearth could only reach a limited area. For those sleeping farthest from the fire, the insulation provided by wool blankets and furs was vital for survival. The bedding arrangements in Viking homes reflected the communal nature of Viking society. In larger longhouses, multiple families would often sleep in close proximity to one another, sharing space for warmth. In these shared spaces, the bedding would be arranged in a way that maximized the amount of heat retained by each person. Often, individuals would sleep in groups, with several people huddled together under the same blankets and furs to keep warm. In this sense, bedding was not only a practical necessity, but also an important social element. It was common for families to share a bed, particularly in the longhouses where space was limited, and this closeness helped maintain warmth during the coldest months. In addition to these practical considerations, Viking bedding and clothing had cultural significance. For example, clothing and bedding made from the pelts of certain animals could indicate a person's social status or profession. A Viking warrior might wear a cloak made from the fur of a wolf or bear, symbolizing strength and courage, while a wealthy trader or noble might have bedding made from the finest furs and woolen blankets. The use of materials like fur and wool was also a reflection of the Vikings' relationship with the animals they hunted and raised. They saw these materials not just as a means of survival, but as a part of their cultural identity, and the craftsmanship involved in creating clothing and bedding was a point of pride. As the Viking people traveled and settled across Europe, they adapted their clothing and bedding systems to the new environments they encountered. In warmer regions, their use of wool and fur might have been lessened, but the importance of layering and insulation remained. As they encountered other cultures, the Vikings also adapted new techniques and materials, incorporating them into their own clothing and bedding systems. The Vikings' ability to adapt and make use of available resources was a key factor in their success, and it allowed them to endure even the harshest winters while maintaining a distinctive cultural identity. The clothing and bedding of the Vikings were designed to ensure warmth, comfort, and survival in one of the most challenging climates on Earth. Wool, fur, and leather were the primary materials used to create clothing that could withstand freezing temperatures, while layering helped to retain body heat. Bedding made from straw, animal skins, and wool provided the necessary insulation for a warm night's sleep. The Vikings' approach to clothing and bedding was both practical and ingenious, and it played a crucial role in their ability to endure the long, cold winters of Scandinavia. By utilizing the resources available to them, they created systems that not only kept them warm, but also reflected their deep connection to the land and animals that sustained them. In the harsh, frigid winters of Scandinavia, the Viking longhouse served as the heart of daily life. These longhouses, often shared by extended families, were designed not only to provide shelter, but also to foster community and shared warmth. The longhouse was a central hub for both living and survival, with one of the most crucial aspects being the sleeping arrangements. While the cold of winter brought with it challenges that would have been nearly impossible to endure without the communal approach to warmth, these sleeping arrangements also revealed much about the Viking way of life and their social structures. The communal sleeping spaces within Viking longhouses were integral to both the survival and cohesion of the family or larger community. The longhouse itself, usually made of wood and covered with turf or thatch, could range from modest to quite large, often stretching 15 to 30 meters in length. These homes were often shared by several families, and the sleeping arrangements within them were arranged in a way that maximized warmth during the long, dark winters. While each family would typically have a designated area within the longhouse, privacy was rare, and families lived close together for both social and practical reasons. The walls of these longhouses were typically constructed with wattle and daub, or a mixture of wood and turf, and inside, the central hearth would provide much needed warmth to combat the biting cold of the Scandinavian winters. Sleeping arrangements in Viking longhouses were not structured in the way we might expect in modern times. There were no private bedrooms. Instead, sleeping spaces were often shared, and beds were typically made of straw, covered with animal skins and furs. At night, family members would huddle together in these shared spaces, not only for companionship, but also to conserve warmth. The close quarters were essential for survival, as it was much easier to stay warm by sharing body heat during the long, cold nights. In some cases, the longhouse would have a raised platform or an elevated sleeping area for the family, while others slept directly on the floor. Regardless of the exact layout, the primary focus was warmth, and the communal sleeping arrangement allowed for a much greater chance of survival during the harshest months of winter. The Vikings understood the importance of warmth, and they adapted their sleeping arrangements to ensure that they could survive the cold nights. With the hearth in the center of the longhouse, those closest to the fire were the warmest, while those sleeping farther away from the hearth would have to rely more heavily on the warmth provided by their fellow sleepers. The family members would often sleep close to each other in close proximity, ensuring that everyone was bundled together, using their collective body heat to stay warm. The use of animal skins, furs, and wool blankets, in addition to their layered clothing, provided a further barrier against the cold, creating an insulated sleeping environment. While the Vikings did not have modern bedding, their resourcefulness with animal hides and thick blankets made their sleeping spaces surprisingly effective at retaining warmth. For the common Viking family, the arrangement was simple and functional. The focus was on practicality, ensuring that the family could rest and sleep through the cold nights without sacrificing too much comfort. In these shared spaces, people would sleep side by side, and while privacy was minimal, this close living arrangement served to reinforce the social bonds of family and community. The Vikings were communal by nature, and their longhouse living arrangement reflected the necessity of working together to survive and thrive in a world where winters could last for months. The children, the elderly, and the adults all slept close together, making it easier for the family to bond during the long winter nights when daylight was scarce. Although the communal sleeping arrangement was common in Viking homes, there were noticeable differences between the sleeping setups of the common folk and the elite members of Viking society. Viking society was hierarchical, with clear distinctions between the social classes. The elite, typically made up of warriors, traders, and chieftains, enjoyed far more comfortable living arrangements than the commoners. Their homes were larger and often better constructed, and their sleeping arrangements reflected their higher status. For the elite Vikings, their longhouses would be grander in scale and more elaborately furnished. These longhouses would have special areas designated for the chieftains or the most powerful members of the family, where they could sleep in relative comfort, while the commoners would sleep on straw mats and skins on the floor or low platforms. The elite often had more elevated sleeping areas, such as wooden benches or raised platforms. These raised areas not only offered a measure of comfort, but also provided a symbolic distinction between the higher status members of the community and the common folk. The platform beds could be made from wood and covered with soft furs, and they were sometimes arranged around the hearth to ensure warmth. The elite might also have access to better quality bedding, including finer animal skins, wool blankets, and textiles that were unavailable to the commoners. These bedding materials, crafted from the best furs and fabrics, provided a greater level of warmth and comfort during sleep. Another important distinction between the elite and the common folk was the amount of privacy afforded in the sleeping arrangements. While privacy was rare in most Viking households, the elite may have had separate quarters or more defined spaces for their families, particularly the chieftains or warriors. These private sleeping areas were typically still part of the longhouse, but might have been set off by partitions or curtains made of animal skins or cloth. This allowed for a greater sense of privacy and distinction, as the elite would often have guests or host gatherings that required a degree of separation from the common areas of the house. The common folk, on the other hand, lived in much more open conditions, with little separation between living and sleeping spaces. In some cases, entire families or multiple families shared a single large room with no partitions, and privacy was minimal. The elite also had better access to the resources needed for warmth. They might have been able to obtain a greater supply of firewood for the hearth, ensuring that their homes remained warmer for longer periods. In contrast, commoners might have had to make do with a limited supply of firewood, especially during the later stages of winter when resources could become scarce. This disparity in access to resources further accentuated the differences in the sleeping arrangements between the elite and the common folk. In addition to these material differences, there were also social and cultural factors that influenced sleeping arrangements. For example, the elite were often surrounded by retainers or warriors who served as their personal guards and companions. These individuals might have had separate sleeping quarters or might have slept near the chieftain or lord to offer protection and support. These warriors would sleep near their leader, ensuring that they could be ready at a moment's notice in case of danger or a call to battle. The commoners, by contrast, did not have such warriors to protect them, and their sleeping arrangements were much more centered around family members and close kin rather than hired retainers or personal guards. While sleeping arrangements in Viking society varied greatly between the elite and the common folk, There were also elements of similarity that tied the two groups together. Both the commoners and the elite understood the importance of warmth and comfort, particularly during the long winter months. The communal nature of Viking life ensured that everyone, regardless of their social standing, would sleep in close quarters to maximize warmth, and they all shared the same basic needs when it came to survival. Even the elite, with their more comfortable living arrangements, understood the necessity of staying close to the hearth and relying on body heat to stay warm during the long cold nights. The communal sleeping spaces in Viking homes were not just a practical necessity, but a vital part of Viking culture. By sharing warmth and space, Viking families not only survived the cold winters, but also reinforced their bonds of kinship and community. These sleeping arrangements, though simple by modern standards, were a testament to the Viking understanding of the importance of togetherness and the shared responsibility of survival. Whether in the homes of the elite or the common folk, the longhouse served as a place where people came together to rest, recover, and prepare for the challenges of the coming day. The long, harsh winters of Viking lands presented challenges for the people who called Scandinavia home. The cold, the dark, and the biting winds created an environment where survival depended on a combination of clever adaptation, resourcefulness, and communal effort. In Viking longhouses, one of the most important features for maintaining warmth and ensuring survival during these harsh winters was the central hearth. This open flame was the heart of Viking homes, providing not only light and warmth, but also a gathering place for families and communities. Given the extreme cold outside and the limited light and heat inside, it is no surprise that the Vikings' sleeping arrangements were closely tied to the location of the hearth. Sleeping near the fire was crucial to staying warm, but it also came with its own set of challenges and potential risks. The proximity to the hearth was essential for warmth, particularly during the bitterly cold Viking winters. A central hearth was typically placed at the middle of the longhouse, and this fire was the primary heat source. Viking longhouses, often built of wood and turf, were poorly insulated compared to modern homes. As a result, maintaining warmth within the home required close attention to the fire, and positioning oneself near it was one of the best ways to stay warm during the coldest months. The hearth provided heat to both cook food and keep the air within the longhouse at a livable temperature, particularly at night when the outside temperature could plunge well below freezing. When the Vikings went to bed for the night, they had to balance the need for warmth with the practical limitations of space. In large, communal longhouses, sleeping arrangements were typically arranged around the hearth, with those sleeping closest to it benefiting the most from the fire's warmth. The heat radiating from the hearth, while essential, was not enough to keep the entire house warm, especially during the deepest cold of winter. Those nearest the fire would have the most comfort, sleeping in the warmth of the central hearth's glow. However, as the longhouse was usually quite large and often shared by several families or groups of people, the warmth from the fire would gradually dissipate as it moved further from its source. Those sleeping farthest from the fire, typically at the outer edges of the longhouse, were more exposed to the cold. This stark contrast in sleeping conditions created a communal effort where family members and residents worked together to share heat and maintain warmth throughout the night. The importance of the hearth for warmth also led to another practice that helped Vikings survive the cold winter nights: sleeping in shifts to keep the fire going. The longhouse hearth required constant attention, especially during the night when the fire was left to burn down. Vikings would often sleep in shifts, with family members or community members taking turns waking up to stoke the fire, add wood, or adjust the flame to maintain an adequate level of warmth. This system allowed the fire to stay alive throughout the night, ensuring that no one had to face the harsh cold temperatures alone. Sleep shifts in Viking longhouses were a necessity, as the fire could not be left unattended for extended periods. The hearth served as both a source of heat and light, but it also required constant care. If the fire went out, the temperature inside the longhouse would plummet rapidly, and the family members would have to deal with the intense cold of the Scandinavian winter without the crucial warmth of the hearth. This posed a serious risk to their health, as the cold could lead to frostbite or hypothermia, particularly during the prolonged darkness of winter nights. To avoid this, the Vikings relied on the practice of taking shifts, ensuring that someone was always awake to tend the fire. While the practice of sleeping in shifts allowed the fire to be maintained throughout the night, it also meant that Viking families often had broken sleep patterns. Rather than sleeping through the entire night in an uninterrupted stretch, family members would wake up several times during the night to stoke the fire. This interrupted rest could have had several effects on the Vikings' health and well-being. On the one hand, it allowed them to stay warm and protect themselves from the dangers of the cold. However, it also meant that sleep was fragmented, and the amount of deep restorative sleep might have been limited. This sleep deprivation could have had long-term consequences, affecting the Vikings' physical and mental health over time. Despite the challenges, the practice of sleeping in shifts and close to the hearth played a crucial role in keeping the Vikings safe and warm during the long winters. The communal aspect of this arrangement helped create a sense of togetherness, as families and communities relied on one another to stay warm. It was a system built on cooperation, and the act of tending to the fire together helped forge stronger social bonds. However, there were some significant health and safety concerns related to sleeping so close to an open fire. The hearth, though essential for warmth, was also a source of potential danger. Open flames without modern chimneys or fire-resistant materials meant that the Vikings had to take extra precautions to avoid the risks associated with fires. The long house, with its wooden structure, could easily catch fire if the hearth was not properly managed. A stray spark or uncontained ember could ignite the walls or the roof, especially if the building was constructed with flammable materials like wood and thatch. Fire safety was a constant concern for the Vikings, and keeping the fire under control at all times was essential to prevent accidents. Sleeping close to the fire also had implications for health. While the warmth from the hearth was crucial during the cold winter months, prolonged exposure to smoke and heat could have negative effects on the respiratory system. The Vikings did not have chimneys, so smoke from the fire would often linger in the air, filling the longhouse with a smoky haze. The Vikings would have become accustomed to this smoky environment, but breathing in smoke over long periods of time could lead to respiratory problems such as chronic coughs or other lung issues. Furthermore, the lack of proper ventilation in the longhouse meant that the air inside could become stale, with moisture from the fire and human activity causing the air to become damp. This combination of heat, smoke, and humidity could lead to the growth of mold or other airborne irritants, which could have negatively impacted the health of those living in close proximity to the fire. In addition to the health risks associated with smoke, the Vikings had to be wary of the potential for carbon monoxide poisoning. While the fire in the hearth would have been essential for warmth, it also produced carbon monoxide, a colorless and odorless gas that can be deadly in high concentrations. In a long house with no chimney or proper ventilation, carbon monoxide could build up inside, especially if the fire was not well maintained or the ventilation system was clogged. This could have posed a serious risk to the inhabitants of the longhouse, and it is likely that the Vikings were aware of the dangers and took precautions to minimize them, such as ensuring the fire did not burn too intensely or leaving small gaps in the roof for the smoke to escape. Despite these health and safety concerns, the proximity to the hearth was essential for survival in the Viking world. It allowed the Vikings to endure the freezing cold of the long winter nights, providing not only warmth, but also a sense of community. The hearth was the center of daily life, and it provided much needed light and warmth to counter the oppressive darkness of the Scandinavian winter. The practice of sleeping close to the fire, along with the system of rotating shifts to tend the fire, allowed the Vikings to maximize their chances of survival. However, the risks associated with living so close to an open flame and the health implications of exposure to smoke and carbon monoxide were ongoing concerns. The Vikings' sleep practices reveal a great deal about their ingenuity, resilience, and adaptability in the face of one of the most challenging climates in the world. The hearth was not only a source of heat and light, but also a symbol of the communal effort required to survive in such a harsh environment. By sleeping close to the fire, tending it through the night in shifts, and sharing warmth with family and community members, the Vikings were able to endure the cold winters and build the strong, tight-knit societies that became their legacy. The practice of resting close to the hearth was a crucial survival strategy, and it was a central part of Viking life during the long, dark winters of the North. Viking society, deeply shaped by the natural environment of Scandinavia, had to adapt in extraordinary ways to survive in the region's long, dark winters. The long nights of the winter months, where the sun barely rose above the horizon, presented a unique challenge for the Vikings. In an environment where daylight was scarce, the Vikings had to adjust their sleep patterns, work routines, and daily habits to cope with the darkness. The darkness of winter, lasting for months in some regions, created a rhythm to life that was fundamentally different from the experience of living in places with longer days and more predictable light. To navigate the extended periods of darkness, the Vikings adapted their sleep cycles, worked in cooperation with nature's rhythms, and used available resources, including light sources like candles, to extend the usable hours of the day. The winter months in Scandinavia were marked by short days and long nights, especially as one ventured further north. In places like Norway, Sweden, and Iceland, the sun might only peek over the horizon for a few hours a day during the height of winter. This limited sunlight would have a profound effect on daily life, influencing everything from work schedules to family routines. While the Vikings were accustomed to this cycle, the darkness brought with it a fundamental shift in their daily routines, especially concerning their sleep patterns. One of the most notable adjustments the Vikings made was their sleep cycles. The long, dark winter nights meant that sleep could become a more flexible and interrupted activity. The Vikings did not follow the modern convention of sleeping for 8 uninterrupted hours during the night. Instead, They likely adapted to the long hours of darkness by dividing their sleep into two segments, a practice that is sometimes referred to as biphasic sleep. This approach to sleep allowed the Vikings to make the most of their time in the darkness while still ensuring that they were rested enough to carry out their necessary tasks during the day. Biphasic sleep involved sleeping for a few hours after nightfall, followed by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, and then returning to sleep for a few more hours before sunrise. During the waking hours in the middle of the night, Vikings would engage in various activities, such as tending to the fire, preparing food, or simply staying awake to keep warm. This period of wakefulness might also have involved activities that were less physically demanding, such as storytelling, weaving, or other forms of craftsmanship. This sleep pattern was highly adaptive, allowing the Vikings to stay productive and engaged during the long hours of darkness, while also getting the rest they needed to survive the cold months. The role of sleep cycles in adjusting to the long periods of darkness was not limited to the sleep wake cycle itself. It was also influenced by the Vikings' deep understanding of the seasons and the rhythms of nature. The Vikings were a people who relied heavily on the land and the environment for their survival. Their agricultural practices, hunting, fishing, and even their social interactions were all tied to the natural world. During the winter, when the days were so short, they had to adjust their schedules to ensure that they made the most of the limited daylight hours. Tasks that required daylight, such as farming, hunting, and fishing, would typically be carried out during the brief hours of daylight, while more indoor activities like weaving, pottery making, and other crafts would be done during the long nights. This adaptation to the long winter nights was an essential survival strategy for the Vikings. The darkness did not necessarily lead to a complete halt in activity, but instead, the Vikings worked in harmony with the natural world to maintain a sense of productivity and purpose by adjusting their sleep patterns to allow for more wakefulness during the night. They were able to balance the need for rest with the necessity of making use of every available moment. In doing so, they ensured that their families and communities could continue to thrive despite the challenges posed by the long winter nights. Beyond adjusting sleep cycles, the Vikings also made use of light sources to extend their productive hours during the long, dark evenings. Fire, of course, was the primary source of light in Viking homes, particularly the hearth at the center of the longhouse. This fire provided warmth and illumination, but it was not enough to fully counter the oppressive darkness that enveloped the Nordic landscape during the winter months. To extend their waking hours, the Vikings would have made use of other light sources, such as candles and oil lamps, to brighten the interior of their homes and provide light for tasks during the evening. Candles were made from various materials, including animal fat, beeswax, and tallow, which were readily available in Viking society. The Vikings likely used simple candles made from these substances, which could burn for several hours, providing a steady source of light during the evening. These candles, while rudimentary by modern standards, would have been an essential tool for extending daylight hours. They allowed the Vikings to continue activities such as weaving, reading, and other crafts even after the sun had set. In addition to candles, the Vikings also used oil lamps made from clay or stone to hold oil, often from animals, and a wick made from plant fibers or animal hair. These oil lamps would have been placed near the hearth or in other parts of the longhouse, providing additional illumination for the tasks at hand. The use of these light sources also had a psychological impact on the Vikings. Light played a significant role in combating the isolation and mental fatigue that came with the endless nights of winter. With limited daylight, the use of candles and oil lamps helped create a sense of warmth and community within the longhouse. The light from these sources would have brought comfort, helping to alleviate the physical and emotional toll of the darkness. In this way, light was not just a practical tool for extending the day, but it was also central to the Vikings' social and cultural life during the winter months. While candles and oil lamps provided some light, they were not enough to fully dispel the darkness. The Viking world, particularly in the northernmost regions, experienced a profound sense of isolation during the winter months. With limited daylight, the long nights were filled with a sense of stillness and quiet that could be overwhelming for those unaccustomed to such conditions. For the Vikings, the darkness was something that had to be lived with and adapted to, but it was also something they learned to embrace. The nights were a time for reflection, storytelling, and bonding within families and communities. It was during these dark months that many of the great Norse sagas were shared around the hearth, passed down from one generation to the next. The darkness of winter, while isolating, became a space for connection and cultural continuity. In adjusting to the long nights, the Vikings also adapted their social structures and practices. They did not just adjust their individual sleep cycles, but the rhythms of Viking communities were shaped by the dark winters. Social gatherings, feasts, and celebrations often took place during the winter months, creating opportunities for communal bonding. With the darkness enveloping the land, the warmth of the hearth and the light of candles and oil lamps became the focal point of Viking social life. These moments of togetherness were essential for maintaining a sense of community and morale, helping the Vikings endure the difficult, isolated months of winter. Additionally, the role of light in Viking culture extended beyond just the physical need for illumination. In Norse mythology, the sun and the moon were personified as gods, and the long nights of winter were often linked to themes of darkness, death, and rebirth. The Viking mindset regarding light and darkness was deeply symbolic, and the use of light sources, like candles, had spiritual significance as well. The hearth fire, for example, was not only a source of warmth and light, but it was also seen as a link to the gods and ancestors. The Vikings believed that fire had divine properties, and it was central to many of their religious rituals and beliefs. In this way, the Vikings' relationship with light during the dark winter months was not just a practical concern, but a spiritual one as well. As the Vikings adapted to the challenges of the long dark winters, they learned to live in harmony with the natural rhythms of their environment. The darkness, though oppressive, was not a force to be fought against, but rather something to be worked with. By adjusting their sleep patterns, making use of available light sources, and embracing the communal aspects of winter life, the Vikings were able to survive and even thrive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The darkness was an integral part of Viking life, shaping not only their daily routines, but also their social structures, cultural practices, and beliefs. In adjusting to the darkness, the Vikings did not simply endure, they adapted, creating a life that was as full and rich during the long nights as it was in the fleeting hours of daylight. The harsh winters of Scandinavia, where long cold nights stretch for months on end, presented significant challenges not only to the physical endurance of the Vikings, but also to their mental resilience. The extreme isolation Confinement and darkness brought about by these winters would have deeply affected the psychological well being of the Viking people. Their ability to cope with these challenges was a testament to their mental strength, as they had to navigate not only the physical discomforts of winter, but also the emotional and psychological toll that the long nights and cold could bring. The Vikings adapted to these conditions with remarkable mental fortitude, drawing on their community, their beliefs, and their rituals to maintain psychological balance and emotional well being through the harshest of winters. Isolation and confinement were among the most difficult aspects of the Viking winter. In a time before modern communication and transportation, the Viking people were largely cut off from the outside world during the winter months. Communities would often be isolated due to heavy snowstorms, impassable roads, and the extreme cold, leaving people confined to their homes for weeks or even months. The Longhouse, a central feature of Viking society, became the focal point of life during the winter. It was where families lived, slept, worked, and socialized, with very little to break the monotony of the long, dark days. This isolation, especially in the northernmost parts of Scandinavia, could have profound psychological effects. The Vikings were used to close knit communities, but prolonged periods of confinement within small spaces could lead to feelings of claustrophobia, frustration, and boredom. The absence of sunlight for weeks on end only exacerbated these feelings, as the lack of natural light was known to have a negative effect on mental health, causing what is now recognized as seasonal affective disorder, SAD. The long nights were not just physically draining, but they also wore on the mental fortitude of the Vikings, challenging their ability to stay motivated, hopeful, and productive through the dark months. To cope with this isolation, the Vikings relied heavily on community and family bonds. Living in the longhouse with extended family members meant that there was always a sense of togetherness. This constant companionship helped the Vikings stave off the worst effects of isolation. Rather than experiencing loneliness, the Vikings shared their daily lives with their family and neighbors, making the long winter nights more bearable. The hearth, the heart of the longhouse, was not just a source of warmth, it was a place for socializing, storytelling, and sharing meals. The act of gathering around the fire during the winter months created a strong sense of connection and belonging. Even in the depths of winter, these shared moments helped to maintain the psychological well being of the Vikings, as the social ties within a family or community provided emotional support in ways that solitary isolation could not. Another critical aspect of coping with isolation was the Vikings' mental strength and resilience. The ability to endure the long, cold nights and survive in such a harsh environment required not only physical endurance, but also significant mental fortitude. The Viking way of life was built on a worldview that emphasized strength, courage, and perseverance. Their belief in the importance of resilience was reflected in their approach to the challenges of winter. The harsh conditions were not seen as insurmountable obstacles, but as challenges to be met head on. The Vikings' understanding of life as a battle against adversity helped them cultivate a mindset that was capable of enduring the hardships of winter. Enduring the long nights required more than just physical comfort. It demanded a mental and emotional resolve to keep going, despite the darkness. The Vikings understood that hardship was part of life, and the winter months were simply one of the many trials that they would face throughout the year. Their mental strength allowed them to adapt, to embrace the cold and the darkness, and to find ways to maintain their sense of purpose during these bleak months. Whether they were preparing for the coming spring, working on crafts, or telling stories to pass the time, the Vikings managed to channel their energies into productive activities, all while keeping their spirits intact. In addition to their community bonds and individual resilience, the Vikings' beliefs and rituals surrounding the winter solstice and the dark months were deeply intertwined with their mental coping mechanisms. The Vikings saw the seasons as a reflection of a larger cosmic battle, one that was fought between the forces of light and darkness. Winter, with its long nights and cold, was seen as a time of darkness, while the summer was a time of light, growth, and vitality. The winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, marked a turning point in this cycle. For the Vikings, this event held deep spiritual significance. It was not just a physical marker of time, but a symbol of hope and renewal. The winter solstice was a moment of great importance in Viking culture. It represented the symbolic defeat of the darkness and the eventual return of the sun. As the days began to lengthen after the solstice, the Vikings believed that light and warmth were slowly being restored to the world. The solstice was a time of celebration and ritual as the Vikings gathered together to honor the sun, the gods, and the cycles of nature. Feasts, sacrifices, and prayers were common practices during this time, as the Vikings believed that the winter darkness could only be overcome through communal effort and divine favor. One of the most important gods associated with the winter months in Viking mythology was the god Balder, associated with the sun and light. Balder's death, which was said to occur during the winter, symbolized the darkness and cold of the season. However, his eventual return was a reminder of the victory of light over darkness, as the days would begin to grow longer and the sun would return. The return of light was a deeply hopeful event for the Vikings, as it signified the end of the harsh winter and the beginning of the fertile, life-giving summer months. The rituals surrounding the solstice, including sacrifices to the gods and offerings for a bountiful year ahead, were not only practical in terms of ensuring good harvests and protection, but also symbolic in terms of renewing faith in the cyclical nature of life and death. In addition to the solstice, the Vikings also believed that the dark months were a time when the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. This belief would have had psychological implications, as the Vikings were keenly aware of the fragility of life. The long nights, filled with the sounds of the wind and the silence of the snow, provided the perfect setting for contemplating death and the afterlife. The Vikings held elaborate rituals to honor their ancestors, and these rituals likely took place during the darkest months of winter. The sense of connection with the past and the understanding that their ancestors had faced similar challenges would have provided both strength and comfort in the face of the long, cold nights. Viking funerary practices, which involved sending the deceased off with great ceremony and offerings, also served to reinforce the importance of life's cycles. The rituals surrounding death were a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was the potential for renewal and rebirth. The connection between the dead and the living provided a sense of continuity, and these rituals helped Vikings confront the realities of mortality in a way that brought meaning and purpose to their existence. The belief in the eternal battle between light and dark, death and rebirth, gave the Vikings a framework for understanding the natural world and their place within it. The psychological impact of these beliefs during the dark winter months was profound. They were not simply enduring the darkness, they were part of a larger cosmic struggle that would eventually give way to the light. This provided not only practical hope, but also a deep sense of purpose and identity. The mental resilience of the Vikings was rooted in their belief systems, which gave meaning to their suffering and struggles during the long winter nights. Winter in Viking society was undoubtedly a time of psychological challenges, marked by isolation, confinement, and darkness. Yet, through community bonds, individual mental strength, and their spiritual beliefs, the Vikings were able to endure the hardships that came with the season. Their adaptation to the isolation of winter, their ability to maintain productivity and morale, and their rituals celebrating the return of light helped them not only survive the cold months, but also transform the darkness into a time of renewal and hope. The psychological resilience of the Vikings was not simply a product of their physical strength, but also of their deeply ingrained cultural practices and belief systems, which enabled them to embrace the challenges of winter with courage, determination, and faith. Viking society, much like other ancient civilizations, faced significant challenges when it came to maintaining hygiene, particularly during the harsh winter months. The Vikings lived in a land where the winters were long, cold, and often isolating. Access to fresh water, which was essential for daily hygiene, was limited during these months due to freezing temperatures, and the physical demands of winter survival meant that personal hygiene often took a backseat to survival. Despite these challenges, the Vikings found innovative ways to manage their hygiene and health during the winter, developing practices and adapting their environment to ensure they could maintain some degree of cleanliness and physical well-being during the most trying time of the year. One of the biggest challenges the Vikings faced during the winter was the difficulty of staying clean. In the absence of modern plumbing and indoor water sources, the Vikings relied on natural bodies of water, such as rivers, lakes, and streams, for bathing and cleaning. However, during the winter months, these water sources were often frozen or difficult to access, leaving the Vikings with limited options for maintaining personal hygiene. Cold weather, snowstorms, and icy conditions made it nearly impossible to bathe in the open waters. While bathing was an important cultural practice for the Vikings, it had to be adapted to the harsh realities of their environment. Viking hygiene practices during the winter, therefore, had to be both practical and resourceful. In the absence of regular baths, the Vikings focused on simpler methods of cleaning. One of the most common ways the Vikings managed personal hygiene in winter was through the use of dry cleaning techniques. This method often involved the use of rough cloths or scrapers to remove dirt and oils from the skin. Animal fats or oils could be rubbed into the skin and then scraped off, which helped remove dirt and dead skin cells. These methods were effective at maintaining cleanliness when water was unavailable. Additionally, Vikings wore woolen clothing, which helped wick moisture away from the body and prevented sweat from accumulating, thereby reducing body odor. Another hygiene practice was the frequent change and cleaning of clothing, particularly the woolen garments they wore. Wool was a breathable material, but it could become saturated with sweat and dirt over time, particularly during the physically demanding winter months. The Vikings knew the importance of keeping their clothes clean and would regularly wash their clothing when possible, either by using cold water or by scrubbing the fabric with snow or coarse sand. This prevented the buildup of bacteria and helped reduce unpleasant odors, ensuring that they remained as clean and comfortable as possible given the harsh conditions. In addition to clothing, The Vikings also practiced basic oral hygiene during the winter. They understood the importance of maintaining clean teeth and gums, particularly during the long, isolated months of winter when visits to a healer or dentist were not an option. Vikings would use a variety of natural substances to clean their teeth, including twigs from trees, such as birch, which could be chewed and used as a rudimentary toothbrush. Birch twigs, in particular, were known to have natural or antibacterial properties, making them an effective tool for cleaning teeth. The Vikings also used natural abrasives, such as sand or charcoal, to help scrub their teeth and gums clean. While not as advanced as modern dental care, these practices showed that the Vikings were conscious of their oral health and took steps to maintain it, even during the most difficult seasons. Despite these efforts at maintaining cleanliness, the cold weather brought significant challenges when it came to health, especially in dealing with cold related illnesses. During the winter months, the Vikings were vulnerable to a variety of health problems related to the cold. Hypothermia, frostbite, and other cold related illnesses were common during this time. Living in such a cold environment without the modern conveniences of heating systems and proper insulation, the Vikings had to rely on fire, clothing, and their physical resilience to protect themselves from the elements. The Vikings' homes, particularly the longhouses, were designed to protect them from the cold. These longhouses were typically constructed with thick walls made of wood, stone, and turf, which helped insulate the space and keep the warmth of the central hearth within. The hearth in the middle of the longhouse was the primary source of heat, and Vikings would often sleep close to the fire to stay warm during the long nights. However, despite these efforts, the extreme cold was a constant threat. The Vikings' ability to endure these conditions was a testament to their mental and physical strength, as they had learned to live with the cold as an ever present part of their environment. Frostbite was a particular concern during the winter months. The Vikings, who spent a significant amount of time outside, even during the coldest months, were often exposed to freezing temperatures for extended periods. Hands, feet, and ears were especially vulnerable to frostbite, which could lead to numbness, loss of feeling, and even permanent damage if untreated. The Vikings understood the importance of protecting their extremities, and they wore layers of warm clothing, including fur-lined boots and gloves, to shield themselves from the cold. These clothing items were made from the pelts of animals such as reindeer, bear, and wolves, which provided insulation and protection against the elements. Additionally, when venturing outside, the Vikings would often cover their faces with scarves or hoods made from wool or animal hides to prevent frostbite to their ears, nose, and cheeks. To help prevent cold related illnesses, the Vikings also relied on their diet. During the winter, food became a crucial factor in maintaining health. The Vikings consumed hearty meals that were rich in fat, protein, and carbohydrates, which provided the necessary energy to keep warm. They would consume meat, fish, grains, and root vegetables, often preserved through drying, salting, or smoking to ensure a stable food supply during the winter months. The Vikings also drank hot broths and soups, which helped to keep their bodies warm and hydrated in the cold temperatures. This focus on high energy food helped the Vikings maintain the strength needed to survive the harsh winter conditions and avoid becoming physically weakened by the cold. In addition to the basic hygiene practices and health measures, the Vikings also had access to some unique ways of maintaining warmth and hygiene through hot springs and sauna-like structures. In certain regions of Scandinavia, especially Iceland, the Vikings had access to natural geothermal hot springs, which became an important resource for maintaining both hygiene and warmth during the winter. These hot springs, heated by geothermal activity deep within the earth, provided an opportunity for the Vikings to bathe and cleanse their bodies, particularly in areas where rivers and streams were frozen. The use of hot springs was not only a way to stay clean, but also served as a communal activity. In Viking society, communal bathing was an important social practice, and the hot springs provided an ideal space for this. The steam and heat from the hot springs helped relax the muscles, improve circulation, and promote overall health. Bathing in these natural hot tubs was considered both physically beneficial and spiritually significant, as the Vikings believed in the healing properties of water and steam. Bathing together also fostered social bonds, as it provided a place for Viking men and women to gather, converse, and share news during the winter months. The sauna-like structures, known as bathhouses, were another important feature of Viking life, particularly in the Nordic regions. These small heated buildings, often built near hot springs or using heated stones, provided a space for the Vikings to sweat and cleanse their bodies. The Vikings would sit in these saunas, allowing the heat to open their pores and cleanse the skin. These saunas also helped with relaxation, as the heat soothed tired muscles and allowed the body to detoxify. While the concept of a sauna might not have been exactly like the modern version we know today, the Vikings had developed their own forms of steam baths and hot rooms that served both hygiene and health purposes. In these sauna-like structures, the Vikings also engaged in another practice that helped them maintain physical health: the use of herbal remedies. The Vikings were skilled herbalists and knew how to use plants and herbs to treat a variety of ailments. While these remedies were not always able to prevent or cure serious illnesses, they helped alleviate symptoms and improve overall well-being. Herbs like juniper, yarrow, and birch were commonly used in Viking medicine, and they were often incorporated into bathhouse rituals or steam baths for their healing properties. In conclusion, despite the many challenges posed by the long, cold winters of Scandinavia, the Vikings found ways to maintain both hygiene and health. The lack of access to running water and the cold temperatures limited their ability to bathe regularly, but the Vikings adapted by using dry cleaning methods, frequently changing their clothing and relying on natural resources like hot springs and saunas for warmth and cleansing. They also protected themselves from cold-related illnesses through careful attention to their diet, clothing, and the use of herbal remedies. Their ability to endure the harsh conditions of winter, both physically and mentally, was a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. Through these practices, the Vikings demonstrated that even in the most difficult of circumstances, survival was not only about physical strength, but also about finding innovative ways to stay healthy, clean, and strong. The Vikings, known for their seafaring prowess, warrior culture, and exploration, also developed a sophisticated set of survival strategies that allowed them to endure the extreme winters of Scandinavia. These strategies were not just practical adaptations to a harsh environment, they played a significant role in shaping Viking culture, technology, and daily life. Their methods of surviving the bitterly cold, dark winters of the Nordic regions contributed to the unique characteristics of Viking society that were deeply rooted in resilience, resourcefulness, and the importance of community. The enduring legacy of Viking winter survival is still felt today, as the skills and customs they developed have influenced many aspects of modern Scandinavian life, from the technology they used to the cultural values they upheld. One of the most profound impacts of Viking survival techniques on their culture was the emphasis on resilience. The long, harsh winters required the Vikings to adapt in ways that would ensure their survival through months of isolation and extreme conditions. This ability to adapt was not only physical, but also mental. Winter survival taught the Vikings to endure hardships, push through adversity, and make the most of limited resources. These traits became central to their cultural identity. Viking sagas, which are still celebrated today, often recount tales of endurance, courage, and perseverance in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The winter months, with their darkness and cold, were a time that tested Viking society, and it was through these trials that the Vikings developed a strong sense of determination, both as individuals and as a community. The survival techniques developed during the winter months also had a lasting impact on Viking technology and daily life. The Vikings were keenly aware of the need for innovation to cope with the harsh winters. They built homes designed to conserve heat, utilizing materials such as wood, turf, and stone that provided insulation against the cold. Their longhouses, with their central hearths and sturdy walls, were not just shelters, but ingenious responses to the challenges posed by the long, dark winters. The hearth was central not only to warmth, but also to cooking, lighting, and socializing, serving as the focal point of Viking homes during the winter months. The design of these homes reflects the Viking understanding that survival depended on more than just individual strength. It required an integrated approach that took into account the interplay of resources, environment, and technology. Viking technology also extended to the tools they used for winter survival, from the specialized clothing they wore to protect against the cold to the weapons and gear needed for hunting and gathering in winter conditions. The Vikings were resourceful in finding ways to ensure they could continue their daily lives during the coldest months. The use of furs, leather, and wool for clothing and bedding helped to retain warmth, while layered clothing allowed them to adapt to fluctuating temperatures. In addition, the Vikings developed techniques for preserving food, such as salting and smoking, which ensured that they had enough sustenance to survive when fresh food was scarce. Their boats, designed to withstand freezing temperatures and harsh seas, were another testament to their technological ingenuity. These innovations were not just about survival, they were integral to the Viking way of life, enabling them to explore, trade, and thrive despite the challenges posed by winter. The importance of community in Viking survival cannot be overstated. During the winter months, when the Vikings were largely confined to their homes and isolated from the outside world, the need for social bonds and cooperation became even more critical. The communal nature of Viking society was key to their ability to endure the harsh winter conditions. Families lived together in longhouses, often sharing space with livestock, and everyone played a role in ensuring the survival of the group, whether tending to the fire, preparing food, or sharing stories around the hearth. The sense of community was integral to maintaining morale during the long, dark months. In the absence of modern technology, it was the strength of these social ties that allowed the Vikings to endure the isolation that winter brought. Moreover, the Vikings' emphasis on community was not limited to their immediate families. Their extended networks, which included neighbors, friends, and even strangers, were also vital to their winter survival. In times of need, the Vikings would rely on each other for resources, support, and protection. This sense of communal responsibility extended beyond the household and into the larger Viking society. The Viking Age was a time when alliances were forged, not only for political or military reasons, but also for mutual survival. In the brutal winters, the Vikings understood that their ability to weather the storm, both literally and figuratively, depended on the strength of their relationships with others. The bonds of kinship, friendship, and alliance were vital to ensuring that no one faced the hardships of winter alone. The survival strategies developed by the Vikings also influenced their customs, rituals, and beliefs. Winter, with its long nights and extreme cold, was not just a physical challenge, but also a spiritual one. The Vikings believed that the winter months represented a time of darkness, both literal and metaphorical. The winter solstice, the longest night of the year, marked a turning point in the cycle of darkness and light. For the Vikings, the return of the sun after the solstice symbolized hope and renewal. Rituals, feasts, and sacrifices were held during the winter months, celebrating the victory of light over darkness and ensuring that the gods would favor the coming year. These customs reinforced the Vikings' resilience, as they believed that survival through the winter months was not just a matter of physical endurance, but also of divine favor. The Vikings' belief in the cyclical nature of life and death, which was central to their understanding of the natural world, also shaped their approach to winter survival. The harsh winter was seen as a necessary counterpart to the life-giving spring and summer. The darkness and cold were not viewed as entirely negative forces. Instead, they were seen as part of the natural order, forces that had to be respected and endured in order to experience the renewal and growth of the warmer seasons. This belief in the cyclical nature of the seasons, along with the rituals and customs surrounding the winter months, helped to maintain the Vikings' mental and emotional strength during the long winters. Their ability to view the hardships of winter as part of a larger divine cycle gave them the perspective and resolve to push through even the darkest and coldest of times. Winter survival also contributed to the Vikings' cultural values, particularly their emphasis on individual and collective strength. The harsh conditions of winter required both physical and mental toughness, and these values were reflected in Viking culture. The Viking warrior ethos, which celebrated bravery, strength, and resilience, was deeply tied to the way they survived the winter months. To endure the cold, the Vikings had to be strong in body and mind, capable of enduring hardships and pushing through difficult circumstances. This focus on strength, perseverance, and mental fortitude was not just a matter of surviving the winter, it was a way of life that permeated every aspect of Viking society, from their social structures to their religious beliefs. In the context of Viking exploration and expansion, winter survival techniques also played a role in shaping their ability to travel and conquer new lands. The same resilience and resourcefulness that allowed the Vikings to survive the harsh winters of Scandinavia also enabled them to explore far beyond their homeland. Their longships, designed to withstand rough seas and frigid temperatures, were key to their successful raids and voyages. These ships, built with advanced technology and an understanding of the elements, allowed the Vikings to travel across vast distances, even in the face of the most challenging weather conditions. In this way, the survival strategies developed to endure the winter were also integral to the Vikings' success as explorers and conquerors. The Vikings' ability to adapt to the cold, to find ways to endure the long winters, and to maintain strong social bonds in the face of isolation and adversity became a defining feature of their culture. These survival strategies shaped their daily lives, their customs, their technology, and their beliefs. Winter, with its darkness and cold, was a test of Viking resilience, and it was through their ability to adapt to these challenges that they forged the cultural identity that would become synonymous with strength, courage, and perseverance. The Vikings' winter survival strategies not only allowed them to thrive in one of the harshest climates on Earth, but also provided the foundation for the culture and legacy that continues to inspire admiration and awe today. In the modern world, the legacy of Viking winter survival still resonates in the cultural values of Scandinavia, where the same resilience and resourcefulness that defined Viking society are still celebrated. The Viking influence on technology, from the construction of their homes and boats to the tools they used for survival, can still be seen in the innovations of modern Scandinavian design. The importance of community, which was crucial to surviving the harsh winters of the Viking Age, remains a core value in Scandinavian societies, where social welfare, cooperation, and mutual support continue to play an important role in ensuring the well being of all. Ultimately, the Viking winter survival strategies did not merely shape the way they lived during the coldest months, they helped to define the very essence of Viking culture and laid the groundwork for the values that continue to endure today.